12, 24, 20 to 12. His only affection. In general, everything has become ever the more bleak and cold for me. This includes even my contact with my Kopecky nibbling father. I'm tired and grown impatient from this bleakness by now. I don't know for what its necessity is, but it has something to do with my past and my natural character as well. It seems that I simply need to read more and devote more time to studying and to hermetic asceticism. It's clearly the Almighty's only affection for me, and to study particularly the Quran, as well as Aristotle too. And lately I am certain that I must find the minds of Avicenna and Averroes a way into my now very strict and minimal library. I won't throw away any of my books, to be sure, of course. Though Averroes' work is scattered, and Avicenna's main work, the Book of Healing, is frighteningly difficult to acquire. Its cost is probably well over $400 American. Its English translation is in hardcover, only 4 or so volumes more or less. Some volumes probably not even yet printed in English, and it is composed of well over 4,000 pages of text in the Aristotelian tradition. Perhaps I really should learn Arabic by now, as well as Greek and Latin too, probably. It would take a lifetime to finish the study of this work, as well as to master it. I'm doing some studying similar in fashion to the writings of Aristotle currently. Thankfully, his works that I have are assembled altogether into one paperback edition, of which I've already had since the prior year. Its edition is 1,500 or so pages, and it is an adequate and sufficient enough representation and collection of Aristotle's writings and general thoughts. I myself do agree from now on that Aristotle is in fact the philosopher, as the medieval scholastics had come to refer to him. To me, Aristotle is essentially the only philosopher that I understand to be permissible for myself to study right now, concerning that of the works of which I right now have, outside of the religious texts of the Quran. Avicenna and Averroes and Islamic philosophy in general are of course wholly permissible for myself as well, though we know my rather troubled circumstances in now trying to find some of their essential material work. I am determined to get through and to understand completely enough Aristotle's Organon. I was reading Aristotle even in my bed and covered in sheets earlier this morning. Anyway, come the new year, and when the college again opens, I desire to get some Wagner transcriptions recorded by myself on the piano, particularly so concerning Parsifal, the third act of it especially. I think lately that I have been practicing the specific composition well enough, and have become rather good at it, and I am extremely faithful to its religiousness and the heaviness of it, and am closer to being ready for the acceptable recording of it. I record much of Beethoven too, and Chopin, and even Debussy, among many others too. I was promised myself to utilize that printer I had bought and assemble together some of my self-made sheet music books. I'd love to see my good friend Frigg feature some of my recordings of their work, and perhaps once a week too. Such a treat that would be to me. I've never found joy or cheer in politics whatsoever. Perhaps just so I may know from my friend that she has not ever, nor never will turn to the dark side, or never would give in to any questionable measurement of liberalism or egalitarian populism, or bondage idealism, bondage realism, or vague ambiguous Christian morality. That enough would I know to still be comfortable, specifically with her now hereafter obscured, or her hereafter distanced political direction. Myself, I am still to be essentially and primarily the very same in my master patriarchal moral systematization as I've always been, though I sense in her that she is still to be as such too. We must wait and see what, and if any, real notable good is ever to come about of me in the remainder of my lifetime. I know, of course, I'm pathetic and bleak, and I have become ever the more so by now. My life is certainly no more than a downward spiral. What I do imagine, I admire, revere, and respect the totality of my good friends and family, regardless. My Kopecky Walker nibbling family, essentially and apparently all of them, were understandably very similar to me in their nature and character and so forth. I miss pretty much all of them by now, as astonishing right now as it is to say. Even so, my Walker nibbling mother. Anyhow, we will touch on other subjects in these letters, of course, soon to come. For now, my hell and warm, loving wishes sincerely meant. I send my warmest love and happy thoughts to keep another warm and protected and very blessed in return. Sincerely from Odin. December 24, 2012. 1 to 2013. In relativity to the essential organon. I have been extremely solitary, isolated lately, more and more so, seemingly almost involuntarily in many recently encountered societal incidents, that as though no real body in person is legally permitted to speak to me anymore, or at least right now as at this progression in my lifetime. I'm not certain of Saturn being in my 12th house, not certain either what that probably means. Saturn I understand to attribute to fearfulness. 12th house I attribute to Pisces violet moon essentially. Scorpio rising degree begins. I don't remember. Scorpio death blue green. Scorpio rising. Scorpio rises. I identify with Scorpio. I'm not certain of this. I've become rather doubtful of general astrology lately, then out of date with it. There comes a point when one transcends it all. This one incidentally applies to myself here. I'm indeed now transcending it all, almost entirely, completely by now. So soon this progression should very probably become total for me. This is initially very frightening to imagine, to subsequently experience. Eventually the fearfulness recedes, though nothing less than the formal cause remains. Even so, I even call her the tones to myself sometimes. I tend to eventually abbreviate my friends' names to one syllable generally, again to myself internally. I don't know why I do this. To hear a name by this is silly to me, lightens me up. Following my logic, then my name is necessarily simply Ode. I do this name abbreviation behavior to each of the 6 friends on the show, Friends too, which I do admit I still watch the show rather frequently. Mon, Rach, sometimes simply Ray, Phoebe, Chan, Ross, sometimes simply Raw, Joe, and so forth. I know this behavior is probably really weird, but again, written above lightens me up. Knowledge is difficult to acquire primarily enough. Won't be discussing higher dimensional stuff as much. Good that, from what it seems, her attention and time are turning upward, not so centered on reproductivity, but perhaps post-maternality. I do see some stronger effects from her, really, as of lately. The incarnate is undesirable to affirm most significantly. Never New Year's resolutions. I always serve truth fervently. I'll always serve truth fervently and faithfully. If departure from it occurs, accidentality, mistakenness, then absolve from it immediately. Don't wait or intend to practice this method at the beginning of a new year. Pre-Shaidanism days, clearly such days are better than the latter days, regardless of what the general and particular incidents were to have been experienced a part of them, the latter days as such. Logic is clearly, easily, simply the most difficult to comprehend of the sciences. The informal logic book reminds me to finish the Organon. I've had the essential writings of Aristotle for around a year by now. I still need to finish the very first book of it, but it is so simply for the literary library I've acquired is quite immense. My books, I would read from 4 or 5 of them each and every day, a different selection each time too. I have over 40 principal books of philosophy acquired over 5 or 6 years by now. Now I've stopped reading essentially all of them, save for Aristotle, but there are religious books of mine that are clearly halal to me to read, principally being the Quran, of course, though the Old Testament too, and some New Testaments. Halal is Islamic Arabic for morally, legally permissible. Halal and haram, that is morally, legally impermissible, work very much more effectively over Christian morality approaches such as mere right or wrong, or good or evil. The Quran includes by far the most significant content. Islam, particularly Sunni, and further the more orthodox it is by far the most immaterial and formal of any other religions. What is morally permissible? It is extremely intricate. Halal and haram Sharia applies to essentially every aspect of material life experience: marital, sexual, material consumption, military, economy, hygiene, clothing. There's a great amount of Islamic law to learn from, to study from, to know from. Darwinism, societal degeneration, national regression, and so forth. Islam is initially probably very overwhelming to the Westerner. I went through a phase where I fooled myself into thinking that evil doesn't exist. I did this to myself during a prior phase of mine as well, the incomprehensible, inconceivable Nietzschean beyond good and evil. This eventually resulted in ever more severe and condemnable and damnable punishments by the will of the Almighty. Done so by means inconceivable and blind to me during the time, subtle and grandiose both, but eventually he manifested himself far more stronger and clearly to me, until the turning point that good and evil became evident, sensible and comprehensible, noble again and at last. There are teachings that say polarity is an illusion. There are ultimately four categories to the generation of the universe. There they descend from the primary category ultimately to the quaternary category. I myself understand the primary category and the tertiary category as well to be the two good categories, and the secondary category and the quaternary category to be the two bad categories. And the first of the good categories is the most permissible, and the second of the bad categories is the most impermissible. Again, this is extremely intricate and difficult to explain, although this is essentially the predication of the science of everything, that this is below the Almighty. The primary category is the formal cause, attributable to knowledge, father, north, air, and so forth. The tertiary category is the efficient cause, attributable to contemplation, mother, west, water, and so forth. This first category is the goodness of the male. This third category is the goodness of the female. The secondary category is the material cause, attributed to sensation, sun, east, fire, and so forth. The quaternary category is the final cause, attributable to nature, daughter, south, earth, and so forth. The secondary category is the evilness of the male. The fourth category is the evilness of the female. But it must be written here that these four descend from the formal cause to the material cause, to the efficient cause, to the final cause, in that particularly conceived moral order. But the formal cause is most desirable to affirm, primarily in this to the male. The efficient cause is most desirable to affirm, primarily in this to the female. The efficient cause is attributable to maternality, that is, the bosom of the vulva. The female can acquire post-maternality, the bosom of the mouth, but this is most desirable after her final menstruation. It is clearly desirable to affirm the propagation of children in order to fulfill the Almighty's desire, that is, the human species is preserved, and then they eternally further their praise and worship of the Almighty, which is his most primary desire, if not the only ultimate one. The female begins her affectionate passivity for another during her proto-maternal identification. This predicates the bosom of the bottom. This is the final cause, the daughter, and so forth. The moral order written above clearly attributes the final cause to the least significant or the least permissible of the categories. Thus earth applies to the final cause, as does insects, parasites, worms, and so forth. Then that sodomy is clearly to be completely condemned. Materialism of the West predicates to the final cause. Chastity and cleanliness of woman is clearly a substantival jurisprudence. Here it is seen more clearly, or at least most of this writing applies to some of the elemental, fundamental science of Sharia law of Islam, of some of what is halal and haram as essentially demonstrated above. It is a long chain of logic, I know, but that written above is quite enough a good example of the four categories of formal logic of some of Aristotle as well. But such extreme intensive study of logic does pay off, but again, the correct practice of it is absolutely difficult for most of everyone on this planet to handle, or to command, to understand this effortlessly. It requires essentially years and years of intense devotion to logic, to the left brain hemisphere. If one's left brain hemisphere does not predominate the subject's identity, then legitimate practice and command of formal logic is probably clearly impossible to obtain. My own right-handedness has always been and is by now very dominant. My own right eyebrow is severely far more pronounced and stronger than my left eyebrow, and so forth. That is, the right side of my face is far more expressionable than the left. Very uncommon and rare to see this as such in another person. I sense that most people raise the right eyebrow and are essentially more expressionable with their left side of their face. The right side of the body is logic, law, and so forth. The left side is art, essence, and so forth. That logic, law, is predicable of the material cause east, that it is clearly predicable of strength and firmness, and so forth. clearly explains the normal tendency of humans to behave as stronger right-handed, even so as their efficient cause right side of the brain, the cardinal west direction, and so forth, still dominates the more strongly in them. At least the Westerners essentially are, and always have been, predicated to the right brain hemisphere, to the efficient cause, and so forth. It is very peculiar to them. The Teutonic female is far too beautiful to them, very dangerous. This here, I write, very probably explains the eventual development of the right brain hemisphere, the efficient cause, and so forth, of the Westerner. Only inevitably, that once that beauty is revealed for what is behind it, that is, what is immediately behind this female efficient cause, is only the female final cause. Therefore, the abominable, atrocious, condemned, forsaken materialism of the West up until now. Teutonic female, Teutonic, Germanic, Brittonic, Nordic, essentially. The Teuton is essentially the primary dominator, commander, ruler, sovereign, and so forth of the West, beginning essentially since the Teutonic predication of the Virgin Mary and Jesus of Nazareth. The Pleiadian, from what I've read of the term, is attributable to outer space alien. By no means is the Teuton attributable to outer space alien. The human altogether is the most high material creation of the Almighty. The probability of outer space life is silly. The logic of the universe does not apply or permit life outside of the planet Earth. This would be far too illogical, accidental, the last best of all possible worlds. He simply would not attend creatively to such a thing as that. There's one material substance to begin with, and there is different biology, that is different human and different animal and different plant and different mineral. Carbon is probably predicated to air. Altogether, matter is predicated to air. The material cause succeeds just subsequent to the formal cause, that is fire just subsequent to air. I won't doubt the Almighty, what is and has been revealed to mankind from the prophets, from the angels, from the Almighty himself. None of them mention an outer space biology and so forth. There's higher life indeed, though the air I mentioned of applies only to the material substance of the universe. Jibril, from what I sense, is the most primary angel. Jibril is known to others as Gabriel, who is Thomas Gabriel Fisher, warrior, who is Kvasir in the Nordic pantheon. Mythology, name, title, appellation, way, final, kaput, Gabriel had descended from the Almighty. I don't predicate the Almighty to anything attributed to the material universe substance. That is, therefore, any idolatrous god is totally ruled out, and thus is insubstantial to him. Then essentially only the three most perfected monotheistic, that is, the three Abrahamic religions, apply in these premises. I do understand there to be angels, of course, and archangels as well, too, though the physical, real, material life predication, as though a part of some other planetary system, is probably very doubtful, ambiguous, undesirable to affirm, negative, unacceptable, impermissible, and so forth. It is very peculiar, almost incommensurately ineffable to speak of this to one or to anybody else. Abrahadabra is, although regressed downward and backward, predicated to Abraham. Abra, Ha, or He, major arcana, emperor, which is indeed Arius, which is Ram. Good enough. Ra is clearly Resh, which corresponds, predicates, attributes to the sun. Ra is clearly to the sun, as I believe her to understand the term essentially enough. Or Ra is clearly derivative from Kemetic religion, which Kemetic religion imagines Ra as the sun. The sun is clearly the closest material signification, representation, designation of the Almighty seen to humankind while on this earth. Though of course the sun is still singularly a material creation, clearly not the Almighty himself at all whatsoever. Ra is a collective entity in 8D. So are the other gods. They are entity collectives. How it works is they emanate like suns into individualized existences in dimensions, so the incarnates on Earth are extensions of these beings. The premises of that system is essentially materialism, but clearly the entity collectives predicate to greater and higher extensions. There's the truth, too, that each and every series of predication doesn't ascend forever either. Neither does such descend forever either. Thus the collective entities clearly attributed to angels, archangels, Elohim, seraphim, these latter are both probably permissible too. The series of predication ascends here greater and higher until no further predication can be reached. It is agreed that there is the lowest, densest edge of reality. Clearly there is one edge, one limit. Necessarily there is correctly a highest, finest edge of reality. Of course, by the point of this edge, the series of predication has clearly ascended above universe material substance. The lowest, densest edge is clearly unnatural, rather completely immoral. Indeed, modern, rather essentially Western civilization clearly assigns to this. I do agree essentially enough that source, I think it is sensible to assign to the Almighty, but the Almighty is not within the universe, neither does he surround the universe. The universe may probably be circular, essentially enough, though this universe is very probably ultimately four-cornered. The source, or the Almighty, Allah, is somehow inconceivably incomprehensible to us, above the material universe. But clearly not would the unsound and invalid phrase, as above, so below, apply. That is absolutely offensive and insulting to him. He would never bless the one that proposes this phrase. Therefore, no material in the universe is permissible to praise or to religiously worship. Allah himself is unseen. The praise of him, the Almighty, or so forth, is alone permissible. The praise or worship or glorification of the transcendental immaterialism. The logical ultimate consequence of this, as it applies to humankind alone, would be the preservation of the earth, the cleanliness of the natural habitat, formal humility, and so on and so forth. Everything good entirely. As he is above his creation in every means imaginable, he would not create another himself. He is unseen, unimaginable to us, and so forth. The universe material creation is clearly seen, imaginable, and so forth. Not at all. As above, so below. If anything attributable to the senses had created the universe, then it must have been attributable to the eye. But this particular logic altogether is evermore wholly unsound. Truly, the universe material creation that I've spoken of is attributable to many categories. Rather than 4 of them, I believe that there are 8 of them actually. As it goes for the categories of the universe material creation, clearly not light alone, I term here substance. Then quality, quantity, relativity, activity, passivity, positivity, and durability. Light clearly attributes to the quality category, as well as among some of the others subsequent to it the quality category. Though all the categories, save for the substance category, are predicable to the accidental, unelemental categories. The universe material creation is all of these 8 categories. For what I understand of this, the substance category is termed the substantival elemental category. Very probably the elementals a part of the substance category include air, and perhaps fire both alone. Thus the formal cause and perhaps the material cause both alone here. The remaining 7 accidental categories are termed the adjectival categories, and predicate elementally of water and earth. Thus the efficient cause and the final cause both alone here. The system is manifest and always moral and ordered, though these propositions written here are now most essentially incomplete and inconclusive for the time being. It makes sense, really. Fire and air are clearly not sentimental in the pejorative, disordered chaos sense of the term. Sentimental, disordered chaos is clearly attributable essentially to the efficient cause, and notably to the final cause. The efficient cause and the final cause are accidental, adjectival, essentially and notably insufficient and incomplete. Sentimental, passivity, passion, torso signification, reproductivity, maternality and proto-maternality, tearfulness and fearfulness, and so forth. Palestrina, always soothing and pleasant, always soothing or pleasant to the senses. Palestrina, quite a halal music, probably. Male youth voices singing what seems quite essentially religious enough music is quite permissible or quite morally good. I see that there is, albeit some plasticity in this music, though not total, but not none whatsoever either. It is music peculiar to Christianity. The Christian Gothic cathedral cathedral especially, quite questionable. Really, as though heaven were recreated here on earth, that this in itself is offensive to him. Thus, the music and so forth is ultimately still questionable. I'm very certain that I do not like essentially anything about Christianity anymore. Jesus was a prophet indeed. He was faithful, essentially to formative religious truth, although very probably a severely insufficient prophet, severely obscure, incomplete, and so forth. No divine ascension was truly attributable to him. Jesus was another human, just as much a part of creation as another. Jesus was another human, just as much a part of creation as another. I'm certain enough that he really lived, preached, was crucified, and so forth. Though miraculous behavior, human remedial curation, post-mortal resurrection, and so forth were clearly fabricated by the others, more so by Paul, this was very condemnable a forgery. Humankind then had begun to the worship, praise, and glorification of another man, of humankind, of Almighty's creation, clearly idolatrous, materialistic, immoral. No life reincarnates into another material form, insensible. The body is material, the soul is immaterial. The body terminates, the soul remains. Two, it terminates due to termination of the material cause. Fire extinguishes, the material cause is predicated to fire. Fire to muscularity, to strength. I think this is predicable accidentally to the torso too, thus the heart, the blood. Termination ultimately by termination of muscularity, but the cerebral system must terminate too. This is predicable to air, to the formal cause, but the four appropriate categories altogether predicates to the universe material creation. If air terminates, the body may still potentially live, that is air, the cerebral system, but if fire terminates, the body must not actually live. I would truly need to work this one out, especially so when I'm more conscious and more wakeful. Humankind had never been immortal. Humankind will never be immortal, that is, as though immortal in material formal substance. Immortality is clearly attributable to the Almighty, primarily to, though the Almighty clearly creates his reality, his actuality, and so forth. His human creation comes from him above, ultimately to ascend further and further toward him. No time is immortal, I must say. The universe is caused into being during 1 minute, then is ultimately resolved and totally abandoned. Above his material creation, clearly there is no understandable time as it was understood here. Indeed, I agree, and time is an illusion, and her conclusion from the premise, a component of emotional causation here. Really, below him, here, as we altogether know ourselves, there is essentially but one or probably two dimensions, applying to sensation and contemplation both most significantly. As it goes for eternal life, even though mortal, this is ultimately impossible. For one proof, as I've demonstrated this above already, that the material universe is caused into being 1 minute in time, then it is ultimately abandoned and terminated. I think it is abandoned and terminated, for humankind strays away from him over time far enough eventually. Due to particular circumstances, materialism and vice and shirk abounds. Ultimately, from what I understand of this, the Almighty then has enough of his creation, has it abandoned and destroyed. The day of resurrection. To the original immaterial system, humankind is revealed knowledge of the Almighty, and still this vice and entropy and so forth is sadly far too tempting to emulate and to affirm for the major quantification of humankind. The quantum of the material universe can easily renew itself if the Almighty willed it to do so. He may terminate the universe before this quantum runs out, or he may terminate the universe by the running out of quantum. It is clearly absolutely up to him, or he may renew what we assertively evidence of this quantum, and then after it, he may still terminate the material universe immediately or eventually. Again, everything is absolutely and ultimately up to him. I must admit, though, of course, I still have quite more to know in relation to the truth of Islam. I'm still even quite new to its knowledge, and honestly have yet to read even much of more than a few chapters of the Quran. If I am fallen tired and desiring rest, then clearly I must rest asleep or recover my cerebrality. I don't wish to discuss such things as they are, and have been tired and weary from myself, and thus fallen into logical fallacies and so forth. At least as of much of lately, I've come to watch the show Friends faithfully and almost fanatically by now. I've quite needed to do this. It is clearly understandable that of totally no real physical friendship, nor beloved companionship, nor family or relative at all whatsoever any more. As written far above in the beginning of this total discussion, it is altogether, though initially very frightening to experience this, though it is eventually overcome by tremendous courageous strength, religious devotion, and religious praise, and religious prayer, and so forth. Right now, the prayer of mine is fervently Mosaic. Mosaic prayer is prayer modeled after Moses' prayer, at least for now, from what I understand of his prayer to probably truly have been. His prayer is similar, such as an example is of the staff raised and the sea water moves itself aside. It is essentially possible to do something like this in nature, though really not so extreme as that written example. January 1, 2013. 1/13/2013, reached the stage of being incapable of repentance. All is well here. I'm doing perfectly well, keeping quiet, studying online articles. For a little holiday gift to myself, I finally ordered a white Arabic smog along with an egg-all. It's about time I had begun wearing some headgear clothing. A tobe in public is to be quite a stretch. This is not unrealistic to do, though simply for now I would disgrace the regality of it while wearing it, but only until my own knowledge of the Quran and Hadith and Sharia and so forth becomes acceptable enough and sufficient to myself. I'll publish a photograph of myself with what this smog should look like when it arrives sometime next week. Unutterable. December 25, 2012. I've had a quite wonderful morning. I slipped everywhere on the ice, however. I didn't fall completely, thankfully, though walking extremely slowly to the car, I was forced to run helplessly the rest of the way down the driveway's hill, in order to avoid an otherwise inevitable and complete fall and collapse to the ground. No support to hold on to down the little hill whatsoever. Ha ha. Well, anyway, I made my way to the spot, more or less in the middle of nowhere in the pine forest of the mountains this morning. I had brought a camera and filmed something quite incredible. January 13, 2013, notes of the first filmed scenery predicated to an evening prayer at the mountain's ice. Therein took place temperatures more so than 20 degrees below freezing, with the constant wind gusts in its chill within the teens, if not, then probably lower than this. I had fortunately filmed one initial scene, and the first non-snow scene predicated to this film of otherwise essentially snow-covered scenery, and I soon afterward had forcibly postponed the remainder of the plans that I had had to shoot the rest of this third prayer film, for I had not dressed warmly enough, nor hardly sufficient enough, not at all. My entire head and neck and both my hands were completely uncovered throughout the duration of this work, in preparation for the days then afterward postponed prayer. All in all, the weather climate I had felt to be in and experienced there and then was truly the coldest I had ever been. The temperature of my carabin was clearly becoming ever the more frozen. I had lost my ability to feel my own hands. My thinking was becoming further disoriented, slowed and ever the more sufferable by and during the time that I had begun the rather long walk back to my car. I remembered that I would then bellow these physical, worn-out groans from time to time. My hair was wind-swept, and so forth. Altogether, I had immediately afterward driven straight to the town's grocery store, with a sufficient necessity to prepare for the coming snowstorm that would later come that day, yet all the while within this manner of the truly rugged outdoorsman, visible and perceptible to all and whatever other grocery store customers or people that they themselves would come across. My hunting knife was clearly visible and out of place accidentally to all of the others cozily browsing throughout the civilized refinement during the shopping activity. So were my dazed, oblivious, and blown-out groans. My return to the spot later during the next day, as the elements of the area had indeed snowed. It was a risked adventure even so to drive out to the location. The temperature itself was thankfully not so blistering as the place it was beforehand. and I arrived with much more well-equipped and attire to endure such a high-altitude, mountainous, and severely cold winter weather. The spot itself seems normally to be quite safe from the natural predators such as bears and or mountain lions, though nobody is clearly ever too certain when within such essentially remote terrain such as this place. My intention to use a staff during the prayer films was to have been formalized by the time of this third film, particularly so during the first day that of which the film was to hold itself, otherwise in incompletion. That is, until I would equip myself better with warmer clothing for the later, quite successful enough completion of the film task. The staff itself was found alongside the staff itself was found alongside the Gungnir, so final kaput Junos final is the staff Gungnir itself was found alongside the foremost primary symbolic pine tree predicated through these spots. During the initial non-snow day of filming that third prayer video, I would pick up the branch, hold it always religiously, and utilize my knife and cut off each and every primary accidental stem and jut, and fashion it appropriately into the acceptable staff that it would really become. The staff being the only material element of prayer ultimately permissible in this classification of religious practice. If not, the chalice only alongside with the staff is also permissible as well, though the chalice itself is dubious. To me particularly, at least, it is probably universally impermissible ultimately as well. The finished film is published online for now. I know that Frigg will like this film, especially so the music, of course, as it is of Wagner. December 27, 2012. Ninth Circle, Treachery. The ninth and last circle is ringed by classical and biblical giants who perhaps symbolize pride and other spiritual flaws lying behind acts of treachery. The giants are standing on a ledge above the ninth circle of hell, so that from the Malagulge they are visible from the waist up. They include Nimrod, Ephialtes, who with his brother Otus tried to storm Olympus during the Gigantomachy, Briareus, Titios, and Typhon. The giant Antaeus, being the only giant unbound with chains, lowers Dante and Virgil into the pit that forms the ninth circle of hell. Canto 31. The traitors are distinguished from the merely fraudulent, in that their acts involve betraying a special relationship of some kind. Therefore, concentric zones or rounds of traitors. These rounds correspond in order of seriousness to betrayal of family ties, betrayal of community ties, betrayal of guests, and betrayal of liege lords. In contrast to the popular image of hell as fiery, the traitors are frozen in a lake of ice known as Cocytus, with each group encased in ice to progressively greater depths. Round 1 is named Caina after Cain, who killed his brother. Traitors to kindred are here immersed in the ice up to their faces, the place where shame can show itself. Mordred, who attacked his uncle father King Arthur, is one of the traitors here. Him who at one blow had chest and shadow shattered by Arthur's hand. Canto 32. Round 2 is named Antenor after Antenor of Troy, who, according to medieval tradition, betrayed his city to the Greeks. Traitors to political entities such as parties, cities, or countries are located here. Count Ugolino pauses from gnawing on the head of his former partner in crime, Archbishop Ruggieri degli Ubaldini, describe how Ruggieri turned against him after an accidental death of Ruggieri's illegitimate son during a riot, and had him imprisoned along with his sons and grandsons, condemning them to death by starvation. A number of correspondences, such as allusions to the same passage of the Aeneid, link this passage to the story of Paolo and Francesca, the second circle, indicating that this icy hell of betrayal is the final result of consent to sin. Cantos 32 and 33. Round 3 is named Ptolemaea, probably after Ptolemy, son of Abubus, who invited Simon Maccabeus and his sons to banquet and then killed them. Traitors to the guests are punished here, lying supine in the ice, which covers them except for the faces. They are punished more severely than the previous traitors, since the relationship to guests is an entirely voluntary one. Fra Alberigo, who had armed soldiers kill his brother at a banquet, explains that sometimes a soul falls here before Atropos cuts the thread of life. Their bodies on earth are immediately possessed by a demon, so what seems to be a walking man has reached the stage of being incapable of repentance. Canto 33. Round 4 is named Eutycha after Judas Iscariot, biblical betrayer of Christus. Here are the traitors to the lords and benefactors. All of the sinners punished within are completely encapsulated in ice, distorted in all conceivable positions. With no one to talk to here, Dante and Virgil quickly move on to the center of hell. Canto 34. In the very center of hell, condemned for committing the ultimate sin, personal treachery against God, is Satan. Satan is described as a giant, terrifying beast with 3 faces, one red, one black, and one a pale yellow. He had 3 faces, one in front, blood red, and then another 2 that, just above the midpoint of each shoulder, joined the first, and at the crown all 3 were reattached. The right looked somewhat yellow, somewhat white. The left, in its appearance, was like those who come from where the Nile descending flows. Satan is who's Robert Frederick Walker, who's Satan. Satan is waist deep in ice, weeping tears from his 6 eyes, beating his 6 wings as if trying to escape, although the icy wind that emanates only further ensures his imprisonment, as well as that of the others in the ring. Each face has a mouth that chews on a prominent traitor. Brutus and Cassius are feet first in the left and right mouths, respectively, for their involvement in the assassination of Julius Caesar, an act which, to Dante, represented the destruction of a unified Italy, and the killing of the man who was divinely appointed to govern the world. In the central most vicious mouth is Judas Iscariot, the namesake of round 4 and the betrayer of Jesus Christus. Judas is receiving the most horrifying torture of the 3 traitors, his head gnawed by Satan's mouth, and his back being forever skinned by Satan's claws. What is seen here is an inverted trinity. Satan is impotent, ignorant, and full of hate, in contrast to the all-powerful, all-knowing, loving nature of God. The 2 poets escape hell by climbing down Satan's wagon fur. They pass through the center of the earth, with a consequent change in the direction of gravity, causing Dante to first think they are returning to hell. The pair emerge in the other hemisphere, described in the Purgatorio, just before dawn on Easter Sunday. On Easter Sunday, Lord's Day, beneath a sky studded with stars. Canto 34. From Wikipedia.org. Inferno. Dante. Typing is impermissible to me by now. The keyboard itself has been causing severe consequential torment to me. Whenever, and no matter how softly, warmly, or well-intentioned and so forth, that I try to utilize this, neither has it been causing me any slight, minimal, or light affirmative reward whatsoever, whether I type so even a few short and concise phrases. I fear writing even so right now, and I'm struggling severely not to stray into logical error, neither to backspace many of my letters, neither to make any hammering sounds at all whatsoever on the keys, that which, if I were to do so, will never ever fail to send clearly foremost extremely dangerous elements into irritable causation, impatience, coldness, the lashing of the scourge through noise, with imperfect infallible reminder to stop it, shut it, close it, kill it, that is it as is in application ultimately to the cardiovascular system, then more so primarily in application to the cerebral system. There's far too much that I clearly wish to say. Even so, right now, my television set is on. There are these ultimately distant, remote, dark, very dangerous, violent guardians found even within this television operation, manifest in characters of peculiar consequence, in sufficient correlation and relativity to my very fearful, terribly guarded writing behavior right here, right now. The watchers, record keepers, the guardians on the television prove themselves to be fearful right now, right here, right as well. Even typing is haram. No silent or quiet enough keyboard is available to me soon either. I do love her, Frigg, and I respect her as the foremost primarily anima archetype guardian of mine. I cannot move myself out from this place. I've tried everything I could to do this, and the Almighty still outlaws it. There are 3 acts of this final punishment of mine that are ultimately going to occur necessarily up until the end of this life manifestation of mine, that of which this life manifestation predicates to what I now know as the 2nd hell grade. The first act of this final punishment before what my physical material termination is going to be the infernal displacement of me, whether given no sufficient excuse to be done with this or not, whether it is sense right to my own defense or not. I will then move into street dwelling. Not street dwelling within the mountains, for this would be all too cold during most of the time, especially so during the winter. Down within the primitive urban valley, whereof preside most of my suppressed and volatile shadow guardians, of which this is necessarily going to be the most primary relocation. The second act is going to be the expected and predictable, now becoming breakdown of my automobile, that no monetary income of mine will ever efficiently afford the repairs of this final vehicle of mine. I will then finally become homeless and without any sufficient transportation. The third and final act of the Almighty's complete authorization of my physical termination is that He will somehow cause the entire termination of my monetary benefits, that then there's going to be no monetary income of mine whatsoever. I will then starve into severe malnutrition. Then at night, somewhere in the city, I will very probably will finally be attacked and murdered by essentially a spearmen and loincloth warriors. Then, therefore, this stage will finally and ultimately conclude the complete and total end of this particular life manifestation of mine. Begging for mercy or crying for mercy is ultimately wholly impermissible also. The Almighty is absolutely now eternally furious over this prior prolonged behavior of mine. His mercy does occur here, though this ultimately meaninglessly. A second's duration in time at most, once or twice for every day or two or so, and his occasional direct attention and direct communication to me turns away absolutely immediately, were I to speak or to think or to feel erroneously to him, and any of this just once. This life is clearly a hell grade. January 13, 2013. Note, ultimately to have become ground for treachery. There are lighter hell grades, albeit though still hell grades, and to imagine or to desire a holy ascension above this hell grade meets up with only harder, stricter, and heavier hell fire. There are probably 9 hell grades, 10 purgatory grades, and 10 paradise grades. I myself am clearly, certainly, absolutely confirmed to always predicate to his appropriate, foremost primary archetype. The external body or guardianship succeeds along together with I and him through each ascending grade. The guardianship, that of which predicates and attributes part of to every external animate body, and external inanimate body too, altogether found here in this particular life manifestation as well. This guardianship intermediates between myself and the Almighty, and it watches over me, and it keeps record over me, everywhere that I am and always. The guardianship knows me, though through external knowledge and sensation, that this is not internal, that only the Almighty and I are permitted access to my internal self, though the Almighty and the guardianship correlate communicably between each other themselves. The Almighty can clearly thereby communicate what He knows and sees and so forth of me internally, in passage over to the essential guardianship, as He ever wills to do this. This capability of His among the guardianship can succeed in time almost immediately, though it is not foremost instantaneous. Therefore the guardianship is permitted access knowledge to myself, even internally, though this procedure is through the transaction of the guardianship and the Almighty. And here it is ultimately not absolutely instantaneous, and it takes a little while. Though external access to myself is clearly and always foremost immediate, and this is the guardianship's most terrifyingly intimate and foremost authorized permission into my personal activities. This very formal logical demonstration is ultimately inevitable and very dangerous to speak of more about to any external body, in particular even so, for these premises must be denied by them, otherwise the meanings of the Almighty's nature is far too directly revealed by me and known by me. He hates this creation of his absolutely foremost. He rules and orders the guardianship by this point in time to have his creation here destroyed and completely terminated, very probably to send his foremost primary hereafter solar creation, which is always going to be I myself, to the next subsequent and following higher life manifestation grade, that of which this next higher grade in particular is most probably an application initially to the first hell grade, limbo, though I know of his methodology far too sufficiently and permanently by now in this particular life manifestation of mine. He knows too much. I order destroy him immediately. I am capable actually to fight him, and to postpone his final determinate orders, which the guardianship fears or deliberates to carry out for him. They know, sense, and feel that this is immoral, if not then at least far too incomprehensible and inconceivably austere, wrathful, merciless, and cruel to proceed through with this precedent commandment, finally, completely, and totally. As written above, the knowledge of this is far too sufficient and permanently formalized in me by now. It is clear that the time of my physical termination is going to come soon, very soon or immediately, either one of these divisions of time. I myself remain as the only singular real material archetype by now in any event. Any and all other real external subjects, particularly so here any and all other real external animate subjects, humans most especially, this is attributable to animals too, are by now predicated ultimately to imitative representations of those archetypes by now lost, forbidden, terminated, and disclosed. Human archetypes are as foremost applicable here. The imitative representations can only be unclear, incomplete, obscure, inferior distortions for what I have known to be of those prior archetypes. I understand that there are to be at most 16 of them, of the human archetypes. There are essentially 4 animus archetypes, 4 persona archetypes, 4 anima archetypes, 4 shadow archetypes, most of them of which predicate to members of my Kopecky Walker Nibelung family. In some friendships of mine over time, I am singularly and altogether attributable to the self-archetype. I am real until the end of this life. I do not terminate until the end of this life. I am therefore archetypal until the end. Though my Kopecky Nibelung father, both my Kopecky Walker Nibelung brothers, my Walker Nibelung sister, my Walker Nibelung mother, Robert Satan, Tor, Idun, condemned, and some variable others, but now altogether finally predicated to inanimate substances only. This is very probable until the end of this life of mine, which its end is to be sometime essentially soon. Inanimate substances are attributed predications of computer, television, even telephone. My Kopecky Nibelung father might still be archetypal, even so. The Almighty is all-present, all-eternal, all-knowing, and my real father is predicated quite strongly as an archetype to at least the human properties, qualities, categories, and so forth of the Almighty. The Almighty is always eternal, therefore the very prolonged duration of my real father's archetypal representation. I am surprised I've written all this so far, all the time strongly knowing the very impermissibility and tormentable punishment that almost always necessarily follows subsequently, were I to type on the keyboard, or to write even some phrases with a pen and paper. Especially so were a premeditated writing, even a short phrase or sentence or so upon it. She, Frigg, had clearly meant the most to me in my lifetime, and she had given the most time, affirmative attention, devotion, love, and respect, and so forth, over and to almost altogether. To see all of this altogether essentially unrequited in return had driven me eventually far more austere and insane than the coldest that I never should have been, nor resulted conclusively upon to. I know that she physically dwells very far away from me, that her own identifiable qualities do predicate quite primarily to yours, though to Tor, and to the British archetypal subject, both together as well, and so on and so forth. Our own companionship here was clearly the strongest and most identifiable to me, then, now, and could be as such until the end of my lifetime here. In any event, writing is impermissible and potentially very dangerous and terminal to me. I truly love real friendship, real companionship, real animate companionship ever the more strongly by now. Somehow I must find my own sufficient enough platonic friendship together with the right and certain female, and to further our own friendship into the proto-spouse companionship. Then either move together in a warm, friendly place, or to vow true marriage, or the former and the latter activity both while during relatively close approximation in time. Only imitative representations of the now lost human archetypes real by now. She would not rank foremost primarily among a remembrance of each and everybody else beforehand, though I'd have so much to teach of her and so much to love of her. Her predicable qualities I'd come to know foremost so in remembrance of herself, Frigg. I essentially quest against Islam by now. Its severely austere religiousness is clearly predicable to fire. I need cool water most primarily by now, and I need this probably likely until the end. I do have photography taken of myself in the kafia, by the way. I'll publish them onto the internet immediately after this writing. The eggle doesn't fit over my head, actually. Not at all. Haha. I haven't known my head to have been so wide, really. I've known it to clearly be quite tall and narrow, though perhaps this eggle is simply too undersized for most anyone in the first place. It'd be impossible to wear my kafia along together with this eggle out into the spots where I once again to do and film another mosaic prayer video. The prostration of prayers in the wind, too, would clearly blow the cloth off immediately. I wouldn't wear this headgear publicly otherwise, not out into any place else at all whatsoever. I've not ordered a tobe either, and by now will probably not acquire any more Islamic clothing. I must necessarily restructure everything integral and practical to the knowledge of myself in this life of mine by now, entirely, completely, and totally. The Almighty is quite more merciful than were I to respect and to admire the efficient cause more sincerely and more meaningfully. The female loves to feel her own independence and her own respect and so forth, and most especially in relativity to her other correlative appropriate male. Anyway, I'll struggle to write to the others on here whether this does cause torment, punishment, or potentially severe punishment to me or not. And most ultimately and most appropriately, I'm clearly real and far past the point of wishing to know others merely and only through the medium of this essentially completely inanimate substance innovation known ultimately as the computer. Though I'm still here online and check in online rather commonly too, to her, Frigg's channel in particular, usually the most commonly, of course, always. I'll try to write to her softly and carefully and kindly upon the keys for now at the time being. I have some piano recordings up and coming that I'm struggling with and to complete successfully and professionally, particularly so concerning Wagner compositions. Only Wagner is halal insofar as application of Western piano music is concerned to me. The composition of Parsifal is foremost permissible to me for the time being. My recording of it should be on here soon enough. I may struggle to record my voice too, that is, to record an up-to-date vocal discourse of mine. Sometime soon too, when and if I do get the chance to attempt this again once more, sooner or later. I've also quite a desirous intention to record some book recitations as well. This might attribute to the Quran, though I've become uncertain of doing this, due to my now increasing precedence of dubiety toward the Quran, or at least to Sunni Islam in general. January 6, 2013. For the time being, I'm going to try to find an apartment to move into, one that is affordable, and that of which it is to be of my own sole proprietorship. That is, no other wholly grown male should preside in it alongside of me. I won't live with any other female partner during this time either, though only for the time being as such. I find a platonic friendship with a proto-spouse companionship with rights insert in the female sometime a little afterward. Essentially, my next life step is necessarily going to be of a rather purgatorial grade. I am salvageable, redeemable. There's a sincere mercy truly to be found in me. Therefore, there's a sincere mercy, remorse, reconciliation, probably truly to be found in the Creator for me in return as well. I'm not ultimately condemned for complete, total religious treachery. Much can and is capable of being changed, saved, and eventually enough saved within me and about me into the very final end of my formative spectrum. January 10, 2013. (1/21/2013). Now free to roam. I'm here, in fact, quite comfortably working on an editorial work concerning some prior writings of mine right now. No major disturbances experienced, not even hardly any minor disturbances actually. I'm feeling quite good lately, far much better than the few days earlier that I had been feeling. This, of course, very thankfully. The morning is early, the sun is just about to rise. The sun set over the mountainous horizons, but the prior night was so very beautiful, so blood red, warm and rosy. Currently, I've been searching around for another place, one that must necessarily be singularly and solely my own. There is to be no other completely grown male presided in the residence. Unfortunately, there is to be nobody else whatsoever in the residence either, but this is necessary to be only for the time being. I shall find the right and certain female for me only later, subsequent to the coming situation. That particular thought of healing myself far more legitimately and far more authentically is necessary to remain withheld and incomplete, though only until I am ready to well situated and precedent within my newer, and this time very meticulously chosen and selected dwelling place of healing. In any event, I must return to finishing up my editorial work. I should probably have some piano recordings of mine, both Wagner and my own improvisations, completed and published onto the internet by sometime this next week. My own style of playing is far deeper and more understanding, and far more religious, and more spiritual as well. By this point in time, I think with certainty that Friedrich herself is going to like my upcoming playing quite especially much, actually. January 13, 2013. Indeed, the cheerfulness of the sun has been out, at least rather more frequently as of lately. Still, there is much work that I must do in order to overcome the most severe difficulties and troubles of my life as of right now, though nothing that's very suffering or difficult is really troubling me for the time being, actually. Essentially, there's been quite an improvement in the living condition of my experience during the past day or two. It is very far from sufficient or agreeable, however, though my own work and time, both in application to my apartments and searching, should, or at least must necessarily inevitably yield to more successful result in order to finally transition myself out from the current place and into, at last, a more quiet, warm, humble, and singular place of my own. I will only search for a home in the mountains, always far away and far above the urban, metropolitan, primitive pollution. I'm thankful for the idea that she has given me, it as just an additional opportunity for me to overcome or to evade from the otherwise increasingly severe and terminal reality of mine, though I would not join a musical club or a musical society, though primarily so for the principles of which she had stated to me here already, particularly so for the very probably expected liberal or loose and low disposition of the society members' characters and intellects, for the probable monetary expensiveness of its foundation already involved, and for the ultimately primary reason of which I have been seriously contemplating over this quite frequently and imaginatively since I have read of this wisdom from her, that I am by nature quite a loner, not really happy in company at all whatsoever. This element of my identity does frighten me as to what it is potentially and probably actually going to lead myself into sooner or later in my life. I am 25 years of age, and I'm already essentially absolutely and completely alone, and without almost any real societal contact or support, where I to need someone rather strongly, or where I to become physically efficiently helpless in some certain way. I'm clearly not going to live very long, not much longer at all, probably within this lifetime of mine. First of all and foremost, primarily, I need to get myself out of the current place immediately and move myself into much more quaint, humble, though quiet and warm abode, singularly, solely, and ultimately alone. I'll see where my otherwise terrible predestination will then lead me to. I will very likely practice the piano while at the college tomorrow. Probably during Fig's Day. I will then record an improvisation or two, each of them with the usual characteristic more or less 70-minute length, as well as potentially some far more improved Wagner transcription compositions. Each of them, both the Wagner and the improvisations of mine, should clearly represent a much more refined progression in height of my own playing. For as of now, I strongly believe that my skill has become quite much more refined due to, as of recent behavior of mine, rather very prolonged stretches of practice sessions, up to 4 or to 5 hours at a time, for 3 or so days for every week, all the while during the past month or two. I believe it was so far to have been January 15, 2013. Indeed, my need to converse with like-minded, high-minded individuals is severely strong by now. It always has been. It is severely strong by now, though this is far stronger in me by now. For my real and most true brotherhood companionship, that is what was to have been of the warrior individual Tor and I, has by now been sublimated long into my own memory, in reminiscence of what both he and I once were, what he had taught to me, shown to me, strengthened myself up to be, what he and I had formed and substantiated, clearly completely apart from absolutely every one and every other substantiated composed person imaginable in this world. He and I had lasted for not at all long enough in time, for I in particular had been so very otherwise tormented and plagued and suffered by my own essentially very undesirable work setting and environment, by too much excessive public college schooling at the time, by the very undesired accumulation of severe suffering, and as such ultimately of madness in relativity to my then home environment, that is, of my Quebecy Nibelung father, and also of condemned, of my Walker Nibelung brother condemned. Tor would later have become heavily preoccupied with the Navy SEALs as well. Both he and I could actually have taken ourselves far, very far away, done and have gotten ourselves to extremely absolute states and conditions of strongly well-practiced severe austerity and unshakable discipline and asceticism, real true woodsmen in the great outdoors, in the middle of the truly northern nowhere, the right two brothers essentially for ourselves and for each other, cast out and exiled from all and any international society until the very end. This for good reason, for the best acquisition of our own right and true knowledge. He and I were clearly condemning ourselves to hellfire, immediately and immeasurably so, for having gone, or at least to have started off, into that forever now unfinished mystical and metaphysical direction. Though he and I were becoming the real true heroes of our own generation's mankind, he and I were the foremost real and truly and clearly the foremost formative philosophical warriors, the practitioners of most true self-defense and real survivalist naturalism, in combat and in training against all and any Christian or all and any cheerful, optimistic, sanguinary, insignificant meaninglessness. That is against everybody else essentially, but of our own selves, and as well against every form and method of industrialized, commercialized, mechanized, revolutionized, weak-spirited materialism also. We would leave such to the floods of human waste, into forsaken parasitism. Altogether, alone, he and I had begun to make our own ascension progression quite rather far too, though I myself had resigned from life activity and from further acquired life experience already, and this tragically ultimately so very completely. And this resignation sentimentality, so inevitably strong, profound and helpless, had found its way over even into that very foundation and cornerstone magnanimity of the comradeship brotherhood of Tor and I, that I was truly upset and troubled the whole time, and that this sentimentality had not even begun to occur that much later in the time during the course of our brotherhood, but it had begun as such so very initially into the brotherhood, and during that potentially very real and true triumph victory from over the human parasitism, that this resignation and determination was to fundamentally have occurred, but not more than but only 1 or 2 months into the commencement and groundwork foundation of what otherwise would have been the wholly incredible and tremendously ineffable and unspeakable visions and always totally realistic idealizations, in so very rare but miraculously compatible evaluations in supreme ethics and moral standard formalizations that both he and I would otherwise have never found of such magnanimous and grandiose opportunities again, where both he and I to never have found each other and had never to have begun those unforgettable meetings of ours, those real future plans of ours at that position in time, and his thoughts were kept inside of him for so long that they had enveloped him in insanity, and I too tore, and I too. Now my own thoughts, for so many years, my seed condemned into insanity. This is so very simple to imagine. For he and I had parted ways so soon and so suddenly, and that the very parting of our ways had happened forever and eternally afterward, clearly because of my own then already subsequent archetypal character intellect, and because of my own then already subsequent archetypal identity disposition, that I was the one to shame. Now here is the man, here is the traitor, always, everywhere, from now on, until the very end. You've really screwed up this time, Odin. You have lost your chance. Now your life is over. Time is up. He still remains within my power to contact him, of course. Though by now, I ask myself whether I'm truly that hard to identify with. To anyone now alive, even in the very tour, I had invoked his own title and memory everywhere in my piano playing today, while at the college university. I'd come to know immediately that he, in his mind, his identity, his knowledge altogether clearly had signified, meant, and defined my own discourse, path, and direction, of which, otherwise, this discourse, path, and direction were clearly to have been accidentally, and though inevitably, but preliminarily, and ultimately very wrongly to have been cut off from, separated from, untied from, and strayed from, due to these circumstances, again, written above, and now that he is essentially lost and extremely far away, and hard to see him, or hard to hear him, now ultimately long since gone and irrecoverable. However, so I believe this to be, I'm characteristically extremely too hard on myself. Nobody that I have really met with or spoken with as of recently seems to slightly entertain the possible truthfulness of even the thought that I am condemned to eternal or this very prolonged hellfire, and especially not their entertainment of the thought that of around for religious treachery. If that were so the circumstance, and I think now, then I'd leave it as such clearly and foremost strongly to essentially almost everybody remaining alive today here in this world. Though perhaps the very condemnation of the majority of this very quantity is by now to have become expectant, foreknown, and prophesied, but still this does not contribute to anything substantial to the very excuse of my own quite probable determinate condemnation. I was forever knee-deep in wicked, though it was forever hidden, forbidden, obscured, and denied, and the goodness, the friendliness, the kindness, the warmth, the virtuousness, and so forth that was within me was never truly sincere enough, nor substantial enough. I had far too many troubles, sufferings, and torments already, from the very beginning, to truly be overcome. Clearly, in regard to I myself, and my own unalterable generation, the given position in my time, the given position in my placement environment, my own unalterable physique, the essential unattractiveness of mine, the frailty too tall for the thinness, the sickliness, and so forth, my own unalterable character and intellect, one foremost, primarily precedent, archetypal, and so far removed from probably any or all other human substantiation, my own unalterable identity, ultimately of which summarizes the above three categories, had already altogether predestined myself for the very specific condemnation of mine that was always and forever afterward determined necessarily to have become of me. Though, again, maybe, perhaps I'm premising and concluding far too hard on myself. I ultimately do not know whether this is altogether really truthful, valid, sound, or not. Anyway, despite the rather pathological deductive demonstrativeness written just above, my own day today was in fact quite merciful to me, and it did altogether go quite well. Ultimately, the grandest predication of its very experience was designated by the piano playing of mine while at the college university. As I've written briefly of this already here above, I must admit that the piano playing and the practice of the particular instrument has been, as of recently, over the course of time, quite very prolonged, both in the day's particular individual sessions, as well as in the general frequency of these sessions themselves. Of 4 or 5 hours in length the session I believe it was to have been today. I practiced this specific duration of other playing sessions over the course of the prior 2 or 3 months, the sessions themselves for at least 3 times for every week, and as well these sessions have been mostly consistent of 1 or 2 books, but both of these books, of which the entirety of them are practiced mostly completely, ultimately over 250-something pages of notation, I believe it is that I go through within them each time during a session. I'm becoming ready to record the essential content of these 2 books at this point in time. 2 Wagner books, one of a collection of many transcriptions of his operas, and one of the Parsifal Act 1 prelude, and of which succeeds right after within it to the 3rd act of the opera in its entirety. And rightly so, and I'm excited because of this to finally be done with this. By Frig's Day, I might just possibly attempt to do this task and record from the 2 books almost completely. I'll see about this, though. A blood-red sunrise, strength and power in mystical statehood, metaphysical companionship between Frigg and I to ourselves and for each other, as she and I together are now and then, clearly foremost worthy of what Tor and I together then once were, with good hope and faith, with great power and might. Could our true formal predestination forever afterward be foremost restored once again, I'd bring her along with me. We would prefer horse and carriage. Ha ha ha. Probably no one will understand this. Perhaps from now on only her and I. An eternal, warm, and very affectionate kiss to her. January 17, 2013. I must write only very briefly right now. I'm just about ready to, well deservedly, lie down and go to sleep at last. I have been awake without any actual appropriate rest or sleep since a little over 24 hours by now. The otherwise assertive reason for having done this is simply attributed to the task of recording, which this did in fact take place later on in the afternoon yesterday, of a total of 15 Wagner recordings, the quality of them quite at a prime too. These are well-practiced recordings, though even so nowhere near to being professional, as I would otherwise like my own musical recordings eventually enough to be. Even so, I will still return to record again these Wagner pieces until sometime later on in the future, after even more practice and familiarization is to have become experienced and acquired in relation to these compositions. After the recording session of yesterday, I had returned home later in the night, and since have been working upon the editing process of them. This editing process is essentially finished by now, though now I simply need to transfer the finished tracks to their video files, with the appropriate selected pictures and so forth, and then upload them all together finally onto the account. I'll do the remainder of this task after I rest, however. I'm fallen simply far too tired and exhausted right now. There are 15 recordings done of the Wagner in total, just to let one know. January 18, 2013.